Welcome back to Bearcats Mean Business, the official podcast of the University of Cincinnati's Carl H. Linder College of Business. My name is Grant Freaking, Manager of College Communications and Marketing at Linder. In today's episode, two Linder experts will dive deep into a new topic for this podcast, scholarship of teaching and learning, and why it's important and relevant to both students and faculty at the Linder College of Business. Dr. Dan Peet is an assistant management professor at Linder. His research has been published in Sage Business Cases, the Journal of Organizational Behavior Education, the Journal of Small Business and Enterprise Development, and the Journal of Business Research. Now, in addition to his work at UC, Dan serves in the U.S. Army Reserves as an adjunct instructor for the Command and General Staff Officer course. Vicki Buckley is a senior instructional designer at Linder, a PhD student in educational studies at UC, and an adjunct instructor in UC's College of Education, Criminal Justice, Human Services, and Information Technology, working with pre-service teachers. Vicki's professional and research interests include amplifying student voice through course design and creating vibrant communities in online courses. Welcome and take it away, Dan and Vicki.
Thanks, Grant.
Yeah, thanks.
We're glad to be here.
So let's just start with the basics of what is SOTL? What is the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning? So it's this is something that I've gotten into more and more. I took on the educator position back in 2020, so I've really started to get into this idea of pedagogy and andragogy and things like that. But it's a little bit more than that. So, Vicki, how would you describe SOTL as the education expert?
Yeah, I've got a couple of different ways to explain it. So SOTL is a form of inquiry around teaching and learning. It's usually around one's own classroom and students, but you can partner with others. It could be cross-disciplinary. And it's an outlet for new knowledge creation and also a place to learn new pedagogies to try out in the classroom. So as an instructional designer, I reach to SOTL when I want to try and figure out how to help a faculty member do something in a different way. The big thing is that it's research and application. So it's two sides of that. I have a fun quote from a SOTL adjacent book that I'm reading that I want to share about SOTL. So this is a book from Jessamyn Newhouse. She's one of my faves. So she describes SOTL in this way. So teaching offers us an infinite number of puzzles, problems, and research questions, and an abundant SOTL offers us endless avenues for identifying, exploring, and discussing those questions and problems. So we notice things when we're teaching, and we have these problems and puzzles, and SOTL gives us an opportunity to dig in, dive deep, and kind of sort through them.
Man, I felt every bit of that quote.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I teach somewhere in the neighborhood of like 240 students any given semester.
Gosh.
So it's it's always a challenge to figure out what are the problems, are they getting it? How do we get them to get it better? And then in addition to that, I've always got these adult learners, the Army too, that are also interested in it. So I think we've got some experiences here too of how we've worked together as instructional designer faculty, and how to coordinate on those. But I think Vicki said it best when she said trying to figure out a problem for a faculty member in the classroom is one avenue that it comes up. Another avenue is the instructor has an idea and wants to take it forward, and how do we align this with best practices when it comes to the learning objectives of the course and things like that. So I found this gee whiz neat article I want to use in class. How does that relate to the class? And, we can walk through this with an example. So a few years ago when we went online for COVID, I had this great first day activity in business strategy. And if you remember this one, it was having them create a business using paper. So they're throwing paper at each other and building an industry out of it. And there's no way to mimic that online. So what I reached out to Vicki a few days before the class, and I think in the span of 2 days, we created a whole new exercise around creating crossword puzzles and selling the crossword puzzles to different teams in the class. And I think I came with just an idea, right? That was it. And I still remember the very first thing you asked me was, what were the learning objectives of the last activity?
Yeah.
And then how do we build it out? So that's kind of how we approach that one in one of the classes. So and this is the faculty side, but it's not just important for faculty. So I mean, students are also a part of this too. And I can honestly say it's kind of cool. I've published with several of my students now at this point. I think we've got 3 or 4 publications with undergrad students, case studies, exercises, things like that. And there's also a student role in them providing it back to us too, of giving us feedback and helping us craft these.
So Dan, can you talk a little bit about your experience with SOTL and what it looks like comparative to traditional education research or non-business disciplines?
Yeah, this has been kind of an interesting one. So if I dig into different literatures that are out there and different scholarships on there, some of the other ones may not always have this organizational focus.
Yeah.
So the business side is always going to come back to, how is this improving in our organization, or how are we teaching our students skills for their future working careers? Some other fields may be more focused on, how do we make society better, things like that.
Yeah.
But we in the business school, we always have this focus of, we have to make our students better at business. And I can compare and contrast this a little bit with like the adult learners I work with, where trying to teach somebody leadership in the context of a military setting has a lot of crossover and similarities to business students, but it's not a one-for-one. Mm-hmm. And it's adjusting and always keeping that business focus in mind, kind of in the background. So, and we talked a little bit about how students aren't just the ones that are participating in it too. They're a big part of the collaboration. Mm-hmm. And their feedback is kind of how we improve new teaching methods. This semester, I'm trying out a debate in my design thinking, ethics, and inclusion classes. And part of that is that's been asked for several years by my students.
Nice.
Yeah, they asked, we should do a debate on this. We should, you have the structured reflection discussions we do. You should do a debate. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because when I was having them sign up for the presentations, the first class, the 2 weeks I have debates, nobody signed up for those to the very end.
Oh,
so,
geez.
of course. But then when I was talking to them afterwards, they were really, really excited about it. And this is really how students can express their voice back to the instructors and instructional design. And again, that symbiotic relationship. I get my course evals and I can share them with instructional design. Hey, this is what I'm seeing. What can I do to improve going forward? So I don't know, that's kind of a question. So I've come to you, I've come to Becky before. If I get a negative comment, hey, this is not working in the class, how would you as instructional design help me kind of fix, like, this isn't working?
Yeah, so there are many, many different ways. I think that's one of the beauties of SOTL in general, is like there's not one linear path to teach well, to create an impactful learning experience. And honestly, sometimes like those negative comments from students, they're still learning, even though they didn't enjoy the experience, like there's still some benefit there. So I've got two kind of thoughts on this. So sometimes it just comes down to making your pedagogy visible for students. So maybe you got that negative feedback or that comment because the students didn't truly understand the purpose of why you did things a certain way. So it could be as simple as running the same activity or running, your class the same way, but just framing it differently and letting students know, this is why I'm doing this, and this is the benefit to you.
That's a good argument for sharing the learning objectives with the students.
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes those learning objectives are easy to breeze past because you think it's just like another thing, but really connecting those dots for students sometimes helps. The other thing is I would say let's reach into the SOTL research and do some digging and see what other folks have been doing, because again, that's that application piece. It's not just sharing what you did, but it's sharing it with the intent of helping someone else or helping other students or garnering feedback from your students so that somebody else can apply it in their own context. So that's probably where I would start. My favorite thing about being an instructional designer is kind of that hypothesis testing. So like, let's try something different for that next semester. So that's always an option too. It's just like making little tweaks to see how we can nudge the learning or student response in one way or another.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that, like trying stuff up differently to see how it can be received differently as well. Yeah. And just keeping in mind the broader audience too, like there's a lot of stakeholders involved and, we don't want to ignore the business partners, the people that are hiring our students, or the people that are quite often paying a lot of money for our students to be here. So kind of what's the benefit to parents? What's the benefit to external businesses? And I'll kind of take that second question myself, but how do you see like a benefit to parents of students seeing the SOTL and the faculty doing SOTL?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that reflection piece of SOTL. So with the Scholarship to Teaching and Learning, the idea is that the instructor reflects on an experience and then they share and kind of close the loop. But I think that's there for students too. We know students learn best when they have an opportunity to reflect on what they did and communicate that out. And I think that's something, hopefully, that our students are sharing with their families is I did this thing. I did experiential learning this semester in my business course, and this is how it changed me as a student, or like this is how I'm thinking about my job at the rec center because I see this connection when I'm doing XYZ task. So I definitely think for family members and for stakeholders in general, like students are better able to articulate what they're doing, and our stakeholders can then ask more questions to our students.
Absolutely. And that goes hand in hand with how the business partners that are hiring our students get the benefit too. Because they know if the faculty are doing evidence-based learning and they're using SOTL to get the best ideas out in the best way. It's not just some esoteric theory that I'm teaching, X leads to Y. It's I'm teaching the theory and they're experiencing it, and they're building both the tactile and the mental skills that go hand in hand. So it's one thing to say, I understand how X leads to Y. Now they actually have experienced how X leads to Y. So that our business partners know when they're getting students from here, maybe they don't have the work experience, but they have experienced these problems and these tasks because the faculty are building out the best options for them. So I think that's a huge benefit.
And we also in Lindner, I think we're fairly unique. We have such a close relationship with a lot of our local business partners and some national ones as well, that we get a lot of feedback through our career services or other folks who come to our classrooms. So we know what questions they have and what they want our students to learn. And we can kind of shape our experiences in a way that benefits both those stakeholders, but the students too. So it's like a very reflexive process of learning here.
Absolutely. And if that's not enough motivation to do it, the college has recognized the importance of it. So now it's actually part of faculty reappointment, promotion, and tenure to do SOTL research as part of a total package. And especially for the teaching faculty, that's a huge component of it because you should be getting better. You should be, if you have all these touch points with students, start getting better. And I see, and this is another argument for doing it, is I see a lot of faculty that have these really cool, really innovative tools and processes and projects and case studies and all this stuff they bring into the class, and they don't share it with other people. And SOTL is like the best way to share it with others. And I know I kind of just went through all of those different examples, but I think that's probably the next section is what is the different types of SOTL? So that's kind of the baseline, right?
Yeah. So Dan, can you share, I know we talked a little bit earlier about what we did during COVID, but do you have other examples of a teaching exercise or case that you've developed as part of your SOTL work?
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime I develop something for a class, I always try to think forward of how can I share this outside? And I know it's happening. I actually wrote a case study with a doctoral student, Olivia Anger here, and one of our advisors, Jen Lewis, and that case study is published.
Nice.
It's on mental health in the first year, and we had two stories for a couple students up in the Northeast. That one was struggling with just the course load at an engineering school and not keeping up, and started having some issues with that, and the other one actually had an acute mental health episode. And we published that case study, and now that's being used at the University of Maine's business school in their first year to teach their students.
Nice.
So that's kind of one example of a case study.
Yeah.
I teach leadership, and I'm always looking for cool new leadership exercises. And this is one that I've been working on. This one, it's been under review for a little while, where they have to work on different roles in a team and do a task. And they have roles like the social loafer who's just playing on their phone the whole time. The devil's advocate who's arguing with every single thing that comes up. They want to push back on it. And they still have to do this task, and they're planning a trip. And it's just a really good experience for the different kind of people that they're going to run into on teams, and the leaders trying to keep this all together. So I've done exercises, I've done case studies. There are like lectures and things like that surround it. So those are some of the examples. So once we got that, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, what is the difference between pedagogy and andragogy? That's kind of an important thing to come back to.
Yeah, so pedagogy and andragogy are ways to approach teaching. Pedagogy is typically for younger children around K-12, and andragogy is focused on adult learning. In higher education, we tend to teach with pedagogical practices. So there's a set. It's not like it's an official list, but there are ways that we approach teaching and learning. And we tend to focus more on a pedagogical lens in higher education. We are teaching young adults, 18 to 22-ish, but definitely we want to start considering some andragogical principles as well. With pedagogy, it's focused more on instructors supporting students along the way. So there might be more supports or assistance. It's not self-directed. It's very much the instructor will lead you in a particular direction. But with andragogy, especially with older adults, maybe you've experienced this more, it's more open. Learning needs to be connected to specific tasks. You need to see the purpose. You have the opportunity to create meaning in ways that are important to you. So it's more open-ended, and that tends to support our older students or older adults when they're learning.
And I think that's an important distinction too when we're doing SOTL, to keep that in mind of which framework you really want to work towards. And I've done exercises and case studies and things that work for both, but sometimes it just doesn't. And just keeping that distinction in mind is kind of important. And coming back to these different types of case studies and how students can be involved in this. The UC has the undergraduate scholarly showcase. Yeah. And I'm always really sad to see the business school is very underrepresented there. I've seen maybe 4 presentations from business students. Half of them were my students. So it'd be nice to see more undergrads from Lindner over there showing, hey, business research is a real thing. And this is the kind of scholarship of teaching and learning that we're doing in Lindner. Yeah, so I had one student that presented on an ethical lapse that a teacher had and ended up resigning, and everything went into that. That was a case study. I've also had a student present on a vignette exercise I was using in my ethics course of an ethical dilemma. And we actually have some student data of how they react to that, and they're analyzing that and giving some feedback, and we're going to take that one forward for publication.
Great.
So it's really cool because these students come out of their undergrad education with a publication.
Yeah.
They are published authors. I have one that's probably going to have 2 case studies by the time they graduate. So I think that one's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
And I think that has some pretty important meaning to parents too. Like, this is the kind of innovations that your students are doing. It's not just the faculty here. The students are co-creating, like we talked about, with those teaching methods. And we talk about this in the Army, they always leave it a better place for those in the future. That's what they're doing for future students and how they can play that.
So for the undergraduate scholarly showcase, it gives students the opportunity to use other skills. So not only is the researching there, obviously, but they get to present and share out. So it's a little bit of public speaking, a little bit of critical thinking, and being on your toes if you're asked questions you're not prepared for or you didn't know. So I absolutely think that these opportunities give students different ways to flex their skills and practice for when they are in an internship or their first professional opportunity, which ultimately benefits our partners.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things with that too is that there's an opportunity there for a business to get a decision point out there and have students evaluate it. And I had this conversation with somebody who wants to remain anonymous, but they've asked me to write an anonymized case study. And I'm doing that with a student now. Change the industry, change the company, but keep the decision the same.
Ooh.
And this person wants all the analysis that the students do and anything else. And I'm going to feed that to this person as a way of getting some, analysis on what a company could do.
Yeah.
And we've got a lot of local companies that it's a good way to get their name out there. Now, part of that is probably shouldn't write something negative about that company if you're going to partner with somebody. But this is a good way if somebody's willing to allow their name to be on a case study or a project to expose themselves to the students and to get kind of the students' feedback and analysis on those cases. I'll never forget my intro to management class when I was in college. The faculty member had us analyze this company and then had the CEO of the company in there for our final projects. Jeez. Oh yeah, and we were definitely throwing some barbs and daggers about the decisions that were made. And that CEO took a lot of notes. And he gave us some ribbing, but it was such a great experience and to meet this person and to do that. And I've always kept that in mind when I'm designing these. So I talked before, like you do this stuff and you keep it in a vacuum and nobody sees it. So what's our outlets? So how do we get it outside the walls of Lindner?
Yeah, there are many, many ways. And Lindner has some great, well, I think we'll talk about it later, but Lindner has some great opportunities to share SOTL work as well. There are a lot of journal publications that produce just SOTL works. So within disciplines, so you can look discipline specific, business specific, management specific. You could drill down as finely as you want. There are a lot of publications that are books. So I mentioned my favorite SOTL adjacent book. So there's a lot of narrative writing you could do if you don't necessarily want to produce a work that's like a journal article. You can write something more narrative and not casual, but more accessible for folks. So you could be reading that, you could be writing that. And then there's a couple conferences that are nearby that we both have gone to for many, many years. So the Lilly Conference, the annual Lilly Conference on Teaching and Learning is at Miami University. It's the original Lilly Conference. There are many different Lillys that you could attend, but the one up the road is very great. And then we also have the LT, so Learning Technology at UC conference, which happens every spring. So those are great low to no cost opportunities to get your feet wet with what's going on at local SOTL venues.
Yeah, and if anybody's looking at how to try to find those, Google Scholar is a great place to look, or EBSCO, which is our search engine that we have on our libraries, is a good one. Like you said, discipline specific. Almost every discipline, if you search Journal of Discipline Education, there's one there. So I've published in the Journal of Organizational Behavior Education and the Journal of International Business Education. And they're good publications to get it out there. That's their sole focus. Some different journals will require data of evidence that the teaching mechanism has improved learning, things like that. And that can be quantitative or qualitative data in most cases. Some journals will take it based entirely on a conceptual, as long as you're arguing how you've used it in the past. I've got one under review at a journal like that where it's they don't want data. In fact, they specifically prohibit it, but you have to explain how you've used it in your classroom and show it evidence by arguments of how it's worked well. So that's on the journal side, and I think that's like the best way to get it out there, but those conferences are so good. Yeah. And they're, especially LT at UC, it's kind of low-hanging fruit for us here at Lindner because it's an internal conference, and most of the audience is other faculty at UC. Yeah. And I know you and I have presented there. We've done other presentations, and then a lot of our field-specific conferences, like the Academy of Management Conference, has a teaching and learning component to it too, and getting involved in that. So I got a question for you. Yeah. What advice would you give to faculty members that are going to try SOTL for the first time?
Yeah, I would say I have a whole list here, but the first is start small. You don't have to make it a big thing. It is a systematic process of inquiry, so there are connections to the literature and educational theory that you want to be paying attention to, but you can engage in SOTL and not publish in a top-tier journal. The act of going through SOTL and being reflective and reflexive and sharing your work in maybe an informal way, I think is still just as valid and might be more accessible to you based on your time. The library here at UC has a great SOTL guide. So does our CETL, so Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. They have some great resources for getting started, or if you're nervous about the literature review or you don't know how to connect this thing that you did that's great to educational theory, they've got some help guides to help you make those connections. I think reading a lot of Sodal research is helpful, so you can kind of get the feel for the flow and the vibe. And then here in Linder, I've got 2 specific suggestions. So in the summer, we have our communities of practice and also our Linder teaching fellows in the summer. So those are opportunities to engage in Sodal work. There's no, you don't have to publish as a part of those opportunities, but I think it's a good way to get started and get your feet wet. And then my last one is just to find a buddy who's already engaged in Sodal work at UC. So Dan, I know Natalia Minchek is also pretty well published in the Sodal research. So finding somebody who has done it before, I think is a great way to, kickstart your own process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as an instructor, when we pick up, again, these tools and these exercises that exist, is looking beyond just the exercise and the tool itself and looking at what went into creating it and what went into the backbone, what were the learning objectives. And as you read that, understanding, I think that helps us to frame it going forward if you want to do it yourself. And then I always recommend talk to instructional design because they know this research. They know what they're doing in this area, and they're kind of our experts in this. And I don't think I would have been as successful as I have been without having some of our awesome instructional designers there with us.
Thanks, Dan.
And I want to talk a little bit about collaborating across departments too, because I think this is an important one. I have another case study that's under review right now that has a very heavy information systems and legal component to it. So I worked with a lawyer who was a former instructor at another university and who also is really heavy in the information space. So we're bringing in information systems theory and legal theory, and I'm bringing in the ethics and the human resources theory, and we're writing a case study about using AI as a recruiting tool at a major company.
Yeah.
And just being able to see those connections, I think, is a really beneficial way to show people even outside and to teach our students, like, look, you're taking all these different courses, but they're all interconnected. They're not like one-offs. And especially when we get into some of the BA courses like design thinking, ethics, inclusion in business, or business strategy, or foundations in the first year, to show how there's cross-departmental coordination on these Sodal projects, I think is very, very important.
I also want to echo that I think in the past couple years, now that we're back from COVID, some departments have started doing brown bags around Sodal-like topics. I would love if those were more widely shared so that we could all start seeing what other folks are doing. I think that's a great way to start.
I'll take that as a good hint, nudge, nudge. I need to do a brown bag or a lunch and learn on
lunch and learns.
Sodal.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm on board, but if I'm committing to that, you're going to help me out with it, right?
Yes.
Okay,
sure.
awesome.
No. So Dan, what role can students play in helping faculty bring some Sodal projects to life?
Yeah, and I mentioned data earlier, and I probably should have more generally said feedback. And any of my leadership students that are listening to this are going to start laughing because I say feedback so many times in that class that they write it and they get nauseous when I say it at the end of the semester, or it's just a big joke. But I think it is critical because you don't know if something's working or not until you get the feedback. And that includes people that have graduated and are now working. Give us the feedback of, hey, you remember when you took that course? You remember this thing that you said was really fun and cool? How have you used that? And I'm going to give a couple shout outs to a couple alumni, Lindsay Jones and Amanda Reed, who have graduated a few years ago. And both of them have contacted me afterwards to say how much they learned in the classes and have pointed to specific projects and things that I gave them to do.
Yeah.
And they've seen that in their careers now.
Oh, that's great.
And I think that's a really good selling point for doing this in a little bit more professional, methodical way. So the more students give us feedback and help us out with this, beyond just like helping write a case study, but giving us feedback on how things go in the classroom, I think is critical. And I talk to a lot of recruiters too, to ask them what kind of projects they're seeing and what their feedback is on students. And I use that to reintegrate that into the projects I'm doing as well, to make sure it's mimicking the real world experiences.
That's great. Yeah, I love, for me as an instructional designer, anytime we give students the opportunity to use their voice and to share their experiences instead of just operating from I am the expert, I know what's best, but to really take the time and hear what students are saying in that moment, but then also in the future as well. I think that's so important and meaningful for them because it helps them reflect on what they did and what they're thinking and how it shapes them.
And man, did they come up with some good ideas.
Oh my gosh, they totally do.
I mean, I've had things like, how do I teach this in the class? And I've asked students and they come up with some great ideas. And if they're good enough, hey, come on to the projects. Let's go do an independent study or something and present it at the scholarly showcase. I keep highlighting that one. But I think that's such a great opportunity for them. And then they get the more confidence. They can show that they've done something. And I think this is another selling point to parents and external partners too of, look, your students are helping shape the future of the education at Lindner. And the more we can get external partners involved, the more they're able to make sure that the innovations that we're using in class actually reflect the real world. And I think that's probably the most important thing that they can handle. So just one last piece of advice for faculty, and I think it's kind of a challenge to them, is share what you're doing in the classroom. Make sure it's grounded well in theory. Work with the instructional designers that know what they're doing. Make sure that we're actually building real world skills for the students and share it and get it out there. Because I've learned so much from other people. I've talked a little bit about my own projects and experiences, but I've used just as many of other people's innovations. And I think that's a really, really important part of the knowledge dissemination we do at the university.
Absolutely.
My thanks to Dan Peet and Vicki Buckley for stopping by the Linder Podcast Studio today to educate listeners on the scholarship of teaching and learning at the Linder College of Business and beyond. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing or leaving a 5-star review for Bearcats Mean Business on Spotify or Apple Podcasts so that we can continue to bring you enjoyable content. Thanks for tuning in. Go Bearcats!